Good morning. If you have not got a packet of the emblems for the Lord's Supper, what we're going to do is after I'm done preaching this sermon, I'm going to lead us in prayer for the Lord's Supper, and then I'm going to get down and we're going to have a song, and then I'll get back up and do an invitation. And so this is what we do about 4 times a year whenever there's a fifth Sunday of the month. So this whole sermon is the Lord's Supper talk for today. And as we orient ourselves around the table, I want us to look at this passage in Matthew chapter 27. And the context of this is Jesus has already been mistreated, he's been whipped and scourged, and he's on the cross. And by the time that this reading starts, Jesus will have been on the cross already for about 3 hours. But there are some truths that need to be communicated with more than just words. The song that we just sang about, "Were You There?" Have you imagined yourself being in this scene, watching all of these things take place, where it feels like you can think back at memories of the way you've meditated on these passages that, yeah, I feel like I was there. I feel like I saw all of these things taking place. There's a lot of things that we can do when looking at these texts in the New Testament that detail the crucifixion of Jesus. But when Jesus was being crucified, this was something that was earth-shattering, literally, with the earthquake that happened. But here's a chart that shows you all of the miracles that took place while Jesus was on the cross. You can see here that John doesn't record any of them. Luke and Mark record the darkness and the torn veil, but it's only the Gospel of Matthew that includes all 4 of these miraculous things that took place while he was on the cross. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at this account in Matthew and consider what is it that each of these miraculous things happening on the cross mean and signal about his death. The marvel of Jesus' crucifixion is itself surrounded by marvels. And so we're just going to think about each of those things that happen while he's on the cross and what God is communicating by means of these miraculous things about what we're about to do with taking the Lord's Supper. Let's go ahead and read Matthew chapter 27, starting in verse 45. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani?" That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And some of the bystanders hearing it said, "This man is calling Elijah." And one of them at once ran and took a sponge filled with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink. But the others said, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the city, the holy city, and appeared to many. For when the centurion and those who were with him keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, "Truly this was the Son of God." There were also many women there looking from a distance who had followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Joseph and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Now, in this scene here, how long do you think it took to spread the news of what happened while Jesus was on the cross? I think given the unique and amazing things that are being recorded here, this would have been something that would have been the talk of the town. In fact, do you remember after Jesus was raised from the dead and he's on the road to Emmaus and he acts like he doesn't know what's been going on the last few days? There's those people that he ends up talking to in Luke 24:18 where they say to Jesus, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" I have to believe that part of what they're talking about here would have been these miraculous events that took place while Jesus was on the cross. And in this text, you've got the testimony of the centurion and the other trained soldiers who know how to execute people, that when they see the earthquake, when they see the way that Jesus breathes his last, they know that there's something different about him. The text ends by talking about the many women that were following Jesus. Some of them were ministering to him. It was uncommon in this day for a rabbi to have female followers. And in Jesus' last moments, you have these women watching on what's happening. Imagine these people knowing about these things. Even if you weren't watching the crucifixion take place, you would have felt the earthquake. You would have known about the darkness because you would have experienced that. And so this is the talk of the town. In fact, about 137 years later, there was a non-Christian named Phlegon who reported about some of these events, where he wrote this: "It became night in the 6th hour of the day, so that the stars even appeared in the heavens. There was a great earthquake in Bithynia, and many things were overturned in Nicaea." There's eyewitness testimony about these things. But of course, it's not just that this actually happened, it did. But there's a deeper meaning to all of these miracles that are taking place. And you notice that all of the realms of creation are being impacted by these miracles. The sky with the darkness. And some people want to debate, well, was this a solar eclipse or something? Well, solar eclipses don't last 3 hours. And so this is something that God is doing. You've got the spiritual realm with the torn veil in the temple. I understand that that's happening in the temple on earth, but it's affecting the spiritual realm, and we'll say more about that in a little bit. And then you have the earth with the earthquake. That's an obvious one. And then the Bible speaks of those things that are under the earth. You've got people that are in these tombs, in these graves, that are being opened up, and they're walking around and appearing to many people. Everything is being impacted by these miracles that are happening while Jesus is on the cross. But as we just sang, were you there? Try to imagine that you were in this scene from the perspective of emphasizing more so the miraculous things. Imagine that you've been a spectator of Jesus' crucifixion, and you've seen him up on the cross for 3 hours, and there's criminals on his left and his right, and right at high noon, it just gets pitch black. So much so that if Phlegon was right, you would have been able to see the stars in the heavens because it got so dark. The time of the day where you expect it to be the hottest and the brightest is when it gets the darkest. Can you imagine the people that were maybe out plowing in the fields or something? I mean, it was Passover, so maybe people weren't doing that sort of thing. But people were out busy doing things, and everybody just stops. And they ask, what is going on around here? Imagine even if you were looking out at some houses, and through the windows, maybe you could see some people lighting candles, because 3 hours of darkness would require some kind of light. And as it's dark, Jesus cries out, and it says a couple times in this passage, he cries out loudly, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Well, it's dark. Now, have you ever thought before that when Jesus says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, he's up on the cross, and maybe it's hard to enunciate your words, and so maybe they can't really hear what he's saying, and they think he's calling for Elijah. No, the text says that he's calling out with a loud voice. I think they're clearly hearing, my God, why have you forsaken me? And what that does in their mind is it makes them go, oh, God looks like he's forsaking him. Is it time for Elijah to come? You remember what the Old Testament said about Elijah? After he was taken up to heaven in the chariot and the whirlwind, people searched for him on the mountains for quite a few days, and they didn't find him. But then the Old Testament ends with Elijah's going to come back one day, and these people still hadn't realized that it was John the Baptist. Oh, this guy's being forsaken. Maybe it's the time for Elijah to show up and do something, and he doesn't come. It's still dark. And in verse 50, he shouts with another loud cry. Now, if you combine that with the other Gospels, do you know what the last loud cry was that he gave from the cross? John's Gospel records it in John 19:30. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Can you imagine people waiting there in the darkness, looking up at the stars, looking back at Jesus, and they're wondering if Elijah's about to come, and Jesus breathes his last, and he doesn't come. That's his death. But immediately following his death, there's 3 more miracles, and one of them happens a couple days later, but there's a few more miracles that take place. When Jesus dies, there's this curtain in the temple that just rips from top to bottom, and it says that it tore in 2. I take it that it means that it tore in 2 equal parts, not like diagonally or something. It says from top to bottom, not like on the more right side of it, but right down the middle is how I take it. Which shows that this is something that God is doing. Can you imagine being the priests, and this time of the day, being in the temple would have been a very important thing for some of the afternoon sacrifices. Can you imagine being in there, maybe working with the table of showbread or something, and then what did that sound like? Just like a huge zipper or something, just boom, and this whole temple curtain just tears, revealing the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant is. Can you imagine the priests going out and telling other people in the courts, what is it that just happened? What did we do in killing this man? And around that same time, and maybe it was the earthquake that caused it, there's some debate about that. This earthquake shakes everything right when Jesus dies. If you were a spectator and you just saw him breathe his last, and it has been dark, and now the ground starts quaking, maybe there's some buildings that have got little pillars that are falling over, something like that. You can imagine people screaming and falling to the ground, scared of what all this means. And have you ever seen an earthquake? There's nothing miraculous in and of itself about an earthquake, but it's what the earthquake seems to be doing here. It's the timing of the earthquake. But this earthquake strategically opens up certain graves of people who are saints, and it splits rocks. There's some people that have been to Jerusalem that have said that there are some rocks in Jerusalem that look so strange that maybe it's referring to this time when this earthquake was splitting some of them, because we've never seen rocks like this before. Maybe that's the case, I don't know. But these tombs get opened. Can you imagine people scanning around the city, making sure, seeing what was all destroyed, and they're walking around the burial areas, and they go, okay, that one's closed. Okay, there's 3 of them in a row that are open now. Closed. A couple more that are open. Why is it that some of these graves were just opened? And it's going to be after Jesus' resurrection that some of those same people come out of the graves. Now, try to imagine, all right, you're one of the centurion. You're one of the women. And you're looking at all of this, and the sky and the ground shaking, and maybe you haven't heard about the torn veil right away, but you hear about that a couple days later, and there's something different about this man, where the centurion says this was the Son of God. Now, if we were to isolate each of the 4 miracles that are taking place, what are they saying about Jesus' death? What are they doing for us that help us partake of the Lord's Supper in a way that would be pleasing to God? This darkness at high noon for 3 hours, there's some ideas people have had about this. Why did it get dark like this? Some people have speculated that maybe this is God protecting Jesus. It's a really hot part of the day, and the sunlight would not feel too comfortable if you were up on a cross with most of your clothes having been taken off. Maybe it's veiling the shame of being on the cross so you can't see it really clearly, but it's still happening. And so maybe this is God protecting Jesus. That's one idea that people have said. But this reminds us of an Old Testament passage in the book of Amos, in Amos chapter 8, verses 9 and 10. On that day, declares the Lord God, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. I will turn your feast, it's Passover here, into mourning, and all your songs into lamentation. Do you think that some of the chief priests who got Jesus pinned to the cross, do you think that they were pretty excited about what was going on there? That they finally got this guy that they were jealous of up on the cross and we don't have to deal with him anymore? And then it's like God fulfills this passage by saying, this is not a time to be rejoicing. This is the darkest thing that mankind has ever done in killing Jesus. Maybe the darkness is because it's the darkest thing that's ever happened. Maybe those are some possibilities. I think those ideas have merit and they make sense to me. But does this remind you of anything else in the Old Testament? Where there was the number 3 something of darkness, followed by the death of a firstborn. Remember the 9th and the 10th plagues in Egypt? Exodus 10:22, so Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was pitch darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. And then the next plague is the death of the firstborn. I think there could be multiple things going on with this. But I think to a Jew who would have thought about the death of a firstborn around Passover time, with darkness right before then, the darkness when Jesus was on the cross, I think, at least in part, symbolizes something about this new deliverance that we have because of what Jesus is doing. This is the reenactment of the greater Passover. This is the true Passover, where because Jesus went through the darkness, because the firstborn was killed for us, we're the ones that can be delivered from the tyranny of our slavery to Satan and to the fear of death. Had Jesus not died on the cross, we would never have had that kind of freedom. You know, when we come to the table and we partake of the Lord's Supper, sometimes people wonder, well, what kind of emotion am I supposed to have as I partake of this? Is it supposed to be joy or is it supposed to be sorrow? Well, it's kind of mixed. There's a lot of things going on. We have joy that through the darkness Jesus endured, we're the ones that have been set free, but it still came at that cost. And so that's the darkness. Connected to this whole scene is the torn veil, tearing from top to bottom. And to people who knew the Old Testament and knew these passages, they would have known that the torn veil had cherubim woven into it, which would have functioned like a keep out sign. That in the beginning of the Bible, after Adam and Eve have sinned, they're evicted from the Garden of Eden, and God sets up these cherubim with the flaming sword, and you're not going to waltz boldly before that and say, I want to go back into the Garden of Eden. No, because you're going to have your head chopped off. And then a little bit later, when God wants to dwell among the people, it's interesting that when God has them build the tabernacle was primarily for the time of the wilderness. What did the Israelites dwell in the wilderness? In tents. And what is God going to dwell in the wilderness? In a tent. More glorious than the other ones, but he's coming and living like they do in a sense. But even within that, there's this veil, this same one that gets torn, I think, that has the cherubim woven into it, showing the high priest that you don't get to go past this unless it's the one day out of the year that you're allowed to do it. And so when Jesus is on the cross and this veil tears from top to bottom, what is it symbolizing? This keep out sign that man has not been able to draw near to the Lord, it's been destroyed now. And so when the veil was torn, God's presence goes out to everybody who doesn't have him. That's what it's symbolizing, showing that there's ramifications even in the spiritual realm. Hebrews chapter 10 picks up on this in Hebrews 10, 19 through 20. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. It's like what was happening to his flesh was paralleling what happened to the curtain as a way of demonstrating that through Jesus' death, we now have access to God. The question in the Old Testament was, who can go into God's presence? And now in the New Covenant, it's God's presence is going out to everybody, and it starts with this veil being torn. Now, the applications that the writer of Hebrew gives of this, he says, let us draw near. Do you think in the Old Testament that you would have drawn near with confidence to that cherubim outside the Garden of Eden? You think you would have drawn near to the veil before it was ever torn? You think it would have just waltzed in there and be like, hey, I would like to talk to God right now? Now, we shouldn't mistake that we can enter with confidence, but that doesn't mean that we're irreverent. We have confidence to come before God, but we still treat the Lord as if he's holy because he is holy. But we have this confidence to be able to do what people in the Old Covenant couldn't do. And when we come to the table and take the Lord's Supper, are we not drawing near to his table, partaking with him? It's the Lord's Supper. He's the one that's invited you to partake. We're also supposed to hold fast our confession. You know what's happening with the audience of the book of Hebrews? They're being pummeled and persecuted for their faith. Cling to this. Hold fast. When we take the Lord's Supper, we're remembering the covenant that Jesus' blood has created. And it's like a covenant renewal. God, help me cling to this covenant that I've committed myself to. And when we take of this, are there any of us here that's not been committed like we ought to, that we're wondering if we really want to serve God like we ought to? This is a covenant renewal, symbolized for us. Hold fast. Consider how to stir each other up. We're doing this together. We're taking the Lord's Supper together. We're one body functioning together for the Lord's purposes, and it's not just me and the Lord at the table, it's all of us communing together at the Lord's table. But it's all been made possible because of the torn veil. Notice the third miracle is the earthquake. Again, the reason why this would be miraculous is not because every earthquake is miraculous, but because of the timing of this and what this earthquake is doing. But what's the purpose of this earthquake? I think this is showing that power is being demonstrated in the midst of weakness. When Jesus looks like he's at his weakest, God does something thunderous to show his power. The Bible talks about things like this in 1 Corinthians 1:25. The foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. What happens when you take a rock and you throw it into the water? The water ripples because the rock's heavier. What happens when you take a bowling ball and you drop it on a sheet of ice? The sheet of ice cracks because the bowling ball is heavier. You know what the word glory means in the Old Testament? It means weight or heaviness. And there's times in the Bible where God's glory will descend on Mount Sinai. And what happens to the whole mountain? It quakes and shakes because God's heavier than the mountain. Elijah, when he's up at Mount Sinai and he sees the glory of God and it's quaking and shaking. There's times in the Bible where God's glory and power is demonstrated by means of an earthquake. What's the reaction of the centurion? Awe or terror, depending on your translation. When Jesus looks the weakest, we're learning something about what true strength looks like. If you were to say, okay, one day let's say you lived in the Old Testament time before Jesus ever comes. And you go, there's going to be a day where God is going to demonstrate his glory in a way that none of us could have ever imagined. And it's going to be accompanied with an earthquake. You might go, okay, well, so he came on Mount Sinai, and he came in this powerful wind when in 1 Kings 19, and there's other times in the Bible where he demonstrates this great power, Korah's rebellion. He opens up the earth and he swallows people. How is God going to reveal his power? Well, in the New Covenant, at least one of the times, is when Jesus dies and the earth quakes. And the question that we have to ask ourselves from this is, does God's power bring you awe? He looks weak, but God is reminding us that he's powerful. God's showing us through this that he is the one that's above us, even though man has just thinks that they were the ones that killed Jesus and took care of this problem of this guy that we were jealous of. No. God is overseeing this whole thing. God is still above you. Have you had a God quake? Where you've realized that God is the one that gets to dictate your life. God is the one that knows better than you. He's the one that's smarter than you. You don't know better than he does. And when we come to the Lord's table and we're remembering what he went through for us, we're not remembering weakness. We're remembering true power. The last miracle that actually happens, but it's connected to what's happening right at the crosses. These tombs open up, but after Jesus rises from the dead, that's what the text says, after Jesus rises from the dead, then these people also rise from the dead. This brings up a lot of questions. Is this a metaphor? Did this actually happen? Which saints were raised? How many of them were raised? Did they have natural deaths all over again after all of this happened? Did they ascend straight to heaven? I don't know the question to all of this. I think these are people probably that might have died a little bit more recently as a testimony to the people that would have known them when they walk around. But the most natural way of reading this is that there were people who were literally raised after Jesus rose from the dead. So what does this tell us? It reminds me of 1 Peter 1, verses 3 and 4, Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept or reserved in heaven for you. Have you ever put your hope in something that was dying? Have you ever put your hope in something that let you down? That's like trying to squeeze water out of a rock. It's not going to go anywhere. But because of Jesus' resurrection, you have maybe the same day Jesus rose from the dead, these open tombs, people now coming out, signaling that Jesus' death and resurrection gives life to anybody that wants to find it in him. And if you have life in him and you have your hope in him, and as you take the Lord's Supper and you remember to recalibrate your hope in him, your hope is defined as being imperishable. How many things in your garage are perishable? Your garage is too, by the way. How many things do you have in your house that are undefiled? You know, those are the things we keep behind the glass, but even the glass has to be dusted off. How many things do you have that are unfading? We have a reservation. It's kept for us in heaven. And all of this is because of the resurrection. When these people walked around and were a living testimony, it says in this passage in verse 53 that they appeared to many. Jesus took those people from death to life, and then he sets them on display in Jerusalem as they're walking around to other people. Isn't that the same pattern for us? That he's taken us from death to life, and then what does he want us to do? To appear to many, showing them where true life is found. 1 Corinthians 11, when it talks about partaking of the Lord's Supper, it says that we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. When we partake of the supper, we're proclaiming that he died. We're proclaiming and we're imitating and living it out. And we're appearing to many people. We're finding the strength as we come together to have this meal. Meals give you nutrients so that you have strength to go out and do stuff. This is not physical nutrients. It's just a little piece of cracker and some juice. But what does it do for us spiritually? I think when we take of this, and when we think about the miracles taking place at the cross, we're remembering that the darkness has given us deliverance from our sin. The torn veil has given us access to the God that we don't deserve to have access to. The earthquake has shown power and weakness, and the open tombs show that we have a living hope. Those are some things that we can meditate on as we take of the Lord's Supper. Now, again, if you don't have one of these, raise your hand, and somebody will come around and get one to you. But at this point, we're going to go ahead and pray for the bread. Let's bow. Gracious Father,